Hi everyone, welcome to a quick test review for your unit on motivation and emotion. Please note that this is not exhaustive, but hitting really kind of the high points of what you should study and review for your test. We're going to start with the basics in motivation, things that you guys should have down pretty well. First one, drives and drive reduction theory. Now a drive is going to be a biological imbalance. Not enough food, you're hungry. Not enough fluids in your system, you're going to be thirsty. Your body temperature drops, you're going to be cold. We want to reduce any of these things that we find as a biological imbalance. So the drive is going to be the imbalance. The reduction is we want to reduce the imbalance, and the only way we can do that, get something to eat, get something to drink, go get warm. So drive reduction theory is that we seek out a way to reach or meet homeostasis, a nice comfortable mid-ground where we're not too hungry, not too thirsty, not too cold, not too hot, just that lovely mid-ground. Extrinsic motives are going to be motives that come from outside sources, and these can be things that are rewarding, or it could be even the avoiding of a punishment. So the motivation to do something comes from an outside source. You wouldn't have gone to work on Saturday, but your boss promised you a raise. You're doing it for that. An intrinsic motivation, however, is something that's going to be internally motivating. In other words, you do it because you love it, you feel engaged, you like it, you want to do it. You don't have to. There's no other reward there other than how it makes you feel. When we talk about motivation, sometimes these motivations come with either informative or controlling rewards. An informative reward is usually after the behavior, and it's letting the person know how they did, and it can help bolster intrinsic motivation. So the example used in class is you have a kid who does well on a test, and you say, hey, you've worked so hard, we're so proud of what you did, let's go out for dinner. They weren't promised dinner beforehand, they weren't working for the dinner, but the dinner and the celebration is about what they achieved, and hopefully that should increase their level of self-satisfaction and how they feel about what they did. A controlling reward, however, is kind of the opposite. You will get $5 if you study and get an A on your test. Well, you're doing it maybe now for the $5, not for learning the information itself. Once we remove the controlling reward, we may see that the behavior itself entirely dies out. Earlier on, we called this the overjustification effect. If we have somebody who is getting these kind of controlling rewards, they may eventually only do the behavior for the controlling reward. Incentive theory. Incentive theory looks really at the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Instinct theory, this one was the one that toppled under its own weight. The idea that early on they thought that we were motivated by basic instincts, and that eventually they kept labeling behaviors as instincts, and there were so many instincts that you really couldn't differentiate. And the sad thing is that humans are not very instinctual animals. Our primary mode of survival is culture. So we use our history and our transmission of language and the fact that we live in these collective organizations and that we build off of things. That's how we survive, not because we're particularly aggressive or tied into Mother Nature. Set point, that we talked about when we were talking about hunger motivation, but we can talk about it here as well. Set point is going to be where you are at a biological comfortable for usually what we're talking about is weight. Without excessive dieting, without excessive exercising, without restrictive diets themselves, just where you normally fall. And remember, whenever you try to go below your set weight or your set point for your weight, your body starts to slow down your metabolism. In other words, it puts you into a state where your body will try to hold on to all the calories because it is going below its average, and so it worries about being in a state of starvation. And that brings us back to homeostasis. We like to maintain homeostasis, a comfortable midline point. And again, that's true for all of kind of our biological mechanisms. These are the last two basic theories that we need to talk about from that introduction section. One, the arousal theory or the Yerkes-Dodson law. Now with this one, we were talking about the entire idea that there is low or high arousal, but where does our performance become best? And it's really in that moderate mid-ground area. Again, if the arousal is too low, there's no interest and you probably don't care. If it's too high, you're too anxious or it just seems an impossible task. If we want the best performance from somebody, it's moderate. No matter how the questions are worded on the test, it's not about whether or not you would win or succeed, it's whether or not your performance would be its best. The other thing that you guys need to study is going to be Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to memorize all 5 levels, starting with the base one, which is your physiological. So drive reduction theory fits into this very well: breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, meeting homeostasis. After that is met, according to Maslow, you can move on to safety. So this is where you start looking at things like, how secure is your body? Are you actually physically safe? Do you have employment? Do you have access to resources? You build off of that. Love and belonging comes after your safety needs. So this is when those issues of family and health and prosperity develop into things like intimacy and friendship, which before it may have just been being with a group of people so you were safe. Once you are good in love and belongingness, you have friendship, you have family, even sexual intimacy or a partner, you can move on to self-esteem. You can start to worry about how you feel about yourself, your self-confidence, whether or not you have achieved. And then the very last one, the pinnacle, is what we'd call self-actualization. When we get into some other areas, we'll talk about how this theory has been heavily contested and disproven in some places. But just make sure that you understand physiological needs first, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then the pinnacle is self-actualization. We spent a good time talking about hunger motivation, so we're going to move through this rather quickly. Now, on your test, you still need to know the arcuate and the paraventricular hypothalamus. So please remember that the arcuate is particularly sensitive to hunger signals. Your ventromedial and your lateral hypothalamus, well, according to the AP exam, the lateral will make you fatteral, it'll make you want to eat, and the ventromedial will make you recognize when you feel satiated. You should go back and study your chart, the one that we quizzed on and the one that we talked about in class. Not everything is up here, but that doesn't mean you don't need to know it. So be good with things like orexin. You know that orexin is going to be a neurotransmitter, that means it's in the brain, and orexin works with your lateral hypothalamus, it makes you hungry. Leptin, however, is a hormone that's produced in fat cells, and so you can become leptin resistant, meaning that the sensation of being full that should be produced by leptin, some people become resistant to. Be good with glucose and insulin. If insulin is low, hunger should be present. Insulin is what extracts glucose from our blood. Bulimia nervosa, this is when people try to, well, it's an eating disorder where people binge and purge. The binge and purge episodes are the kind of hallmark for this. Be good with media exposure, family relations, all of the things that can contribute to this eating disorder. Anorexia nervosa, 85% of a healthy or an average body weight for the person. So this is when a person's basically putting themselves into a starvation state. This has the highest rate of death amongst all mental illness, and it doesn't matter how the person loses the weight. So they can still lose it by binging and purging like someone with bulimia, but they're going to fall very much below what their healthy weight is. Obesity is the extreme opposite end of the health spectrum for weight. This is people who are excessively overweight. It's important to note that there is an obesity epidemic here in the United States. And again, look at the contributing factors to obesity, patterns of eating, celebrations, media exposure, etc. Your metabolic rate is the rate at which you consume energy, and so women and men, especially comparing the two, men tend to always have a higher metabolic rate, meaning that they consume energy at a faster rate. That also means that they usually keep their weight down. Women don't have the same metabolic rate, mostly because we're created or we're meant to actually have greater fat stores for things like childbearing and producing milk. Externals versus internals. Now this is locus of control. If you have an external locus of control, you are not in control of the decisions, they happen to you. If you have an internal locus of control, you are making the choice and you account for everything that happens to you. Externals are more likely to be obese. Externals are more likely to have problems with eating because food is something that is forced upon them, and not in a literal sense, but you put down, maybe you go to a restaurant and it's known that restaurants make portion sizes too big. An external will say, well, everything's here, I am required to eat it, even though there's no one that says you must eat all the food in front of you. An internal, on the other hand, will choose from a menu and maybe sit there and go, I'm only going to eat half of it and I'll take half of it home. It's my choice of what I put into my body. Also make sure you understand the impact of culture and novel foods on eating patterns. We are made to be very skeptic of food that we don't normally have in our environment. So here's a fruit to the side called durian. It's very popular, I believe, in places like Indonesia. It tastes very sweet, but apparently it smells like dirty socks and stinky feet, and that's not an exaggeration. For us, the exterior of the fruit looks like a spiky pear. The interior looks like, I don't know, weird internal organs. We would probably most likely between smell and look be incredibly hesitant to eat this fruit. But if you were to throw in front of us an apple or anything that we see normally, a pickle, we would have no problem with it if it's a food that you like, because it's not novel, it's not unique. So we're very hesitant to novel foods. There's an evolutionary backing for that one, and that simply is, a long time ago, if you knew a food was safe for you, then you ate it. If you weren't sure, there was always a chance that it was poisonous or that you could get sick from it and die. So we tend to be very cautious of new foods. Additionally, any cultures that live closer to the equator are going to be better with spice and heat, because that's what would have been used to kill off any of the bacteria in their foods, especially their meats. For sexual motivation, make sure that you are good with the sexual response cycle from Masters and Johnson. So excitement, plateau, orgasm, and then the refractory period. Make sure you understand the difference between the female sexual response cycle and the male sexual response cycle. Make sure you understand the role of testosterone. So men have more testosterone than women. Women still do produce some testosterone, otherwise it would be impossible to produce male heirs. The activation of the hypothalamus. Make sure that you do understand that there is a difference in the activation of the hypothalamus in gay men versus straight men. Alcohol is one that we may not have gone into too much depth in the previous video, but make sure that you read up on this. Alcohol is a depressant. It does not make you make good decisions. In fact, it often inhibits good decision making. So people who might be a little bit more controlled in their behaviors, give them too much alcohol, and they may engage in sex, and more likely unprotected sex than in other cases. When we look at orientation and we look at biology versus environment, go back to the fruit fly study. Again, they could manipulate genes in the fruit fly to change its orientation. And the last one that you want to look at is belongingness, which goes back to kind of Maslow and that entire level of his hierarchy. But the reason that we do have sexual motivation is for belongingness needs to be part of a relationship or part of a community. Again, just go through, you have the pre-recorded lecture. I would listen to that one more time, make sure that you are on point for everything. You should also be good with issues of fantasy versus reality, sexual arousal in those cases. So again, this is super streamlined. Please go back, watch that lecture. That's where you guys want to focus your attention. Again, this is going to be a streamlined kind of version of achievement, motivation, and stress. Make sure you're good with thematic apperception tests. This is that entire idea that you see kind of a basic image or a picture and you tell someone a scenario that's going on. The idea being that you're projecting onto that scenario some truth about yourself, and it'll probably give indications of your affiliation versus your achievement needs. If you are motivated by affiliation, it's because you feel attachment to family, and that's whatever your story is telling about. If you have achievement needs, it's because your story talks about progress and work or something that is separate from family, friends, etc. Theory X versus Theory Y. Just remember how I draw it, and I know it's kind of cheesy, but Theory X had the two X'd out eyes with the sad face. Theory Y was a smiley face. And again, Theory X is going to be a management theory that sees workers as people that must be told what to do, that they're essentially lazy, and that they must be kind of managed. Theory Y, much more positive, sees people as productive members that want to do their very best, and therefore gives more autonomy to the worker. With stress, make sure you remember primary and secondary appraisals. Primary appraisal is whether or not you determine the thing to be stressful. If it is stressful, then you go to a secondary appraisal. Secondary appraisals are where you start to assess your coping mechanisms, how you can deal with the stress. Make sure you understand that stress has a cumulative effect. Understand the impact that stress has on your health, on your memory. All of those things are going to be part of this test. When we look at frustration versus conflict, frustration, some goal is thwarted. You are prevented from making or getting something that you had wanted. Conflict, on the other hand, is two competing goals or two competing things that you have to deal with. So we had approach conflict, avoidance conflict, and approach avoidance. Approach, two great things, but you have to only pick one. Avoidance, two negative things, but you have to pick one. And approach avoidance, your decision comes down between something that has one good and one negative, or two goods and two negatives, but you get something that you want, but you also have to accept something you don't, or you get something you want, but something you don't. And the example I used in class is an athlete wants to play their particular sport in college, but they have one specific college that they want to go to. Well, it's approach avoidance if they get into one college that they really wanted to go to, but are told, no, you won't make our sports team. But they also get told, hey, you can play your preferred sport at this college, but it's not the college they want to go to. The last thing that I want to kind of hit on is the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. And again, you should be good with this: the alarm reaction, the resistance, and the exhaustion phase. And remember, as we go through these, the very first thing that you have is low stress resistance in the alarm phase. This is the freak out. This is the here the bad thing just happened. Then you get to the resistance, and this is when you start doing those appraisals. All right, what can I do about this? How do I cope with it? If you are in that phase too long, eventually you get to exhaustion, and this is where the coronary heart disease, all of the other immune system, everything that kind of goes wrong starts going wrong, especially in this end of the general adaptation syndrome. For emotion, make sure that you listen to the video. It's important that you listen to what all of those things are, but first part, the three kind of basic parts of emotion, that it has a literal physiological part, so that is going to be your heart pounding, your eyes crying, whatever it might be. There's a cognitive component. What did you think about? So emotions are subjective, they're unique to the individual. And then there's the overt behavior, so literally how you respond. Be good with the three major. James Lange theory: I'm running, therefore I'm afraid. Cannon-Bard: I'm running and simultaneously afraid. Schachter-Singer two-factor theory: my heart is pounding. This is a really kind of bad situation where things could get really wrong. I should be afraid. I am therefore afraid. Catharsis hypothesis was the idea that by venting anger, hitting a pillow, you would actually leak out or get rid of your negative emotions. So catharsis literally is the word for release, emotional release. The only problem, or the biggest criticism, is that by expressing emotion to get rid of emotion, you might actually just reinforce aggression. Be good with Zajonc and Lazarus. So Zajonc said no conscious thought, that you could have that dirty and quick processing, that it could go straight from your kind of visual system to the thalamus, straight to the amygdala, before there was any kind of awareness of why you should have an emotion. And again, this was that really kind of dirty processing. Lazarus still had cognitive appraisal, but unlike Schachter-Singer two-factor, he said, wait a minute, maybe you have it, but it's at an unconscious level. So you process the danger, but the only way to know that you should have fear of it or some kind of set emotion is because you had thought about it before. Here off to the right hand side, you have valence versus arousal. Be good with these. Okay, high arousal, low arousal. So think high arousal, very outgoing or very expressive. Low arousal, not very expressive, kind of more in that like chill zone. Positive versus negative valence. Positive, good emotions. Negative, bad emotions. Last couple of things with emotion, and please, I'm going to go through these quick. Make sure you go back and you look at fear and aggression. Look at the role of the amygdala. Make sure that you look at facial expression, the idea that there are 7 basic facial expressions. That's going to be Kanazawa and Carol Izard's research, even though they are separated by a couple of decades. Look at your autonomic nervous system when it comes to fear and aggression. Epinephrine, that neurotransmitter that is going to be associated with the autonomic nervous system in fight or flight. Make sure you look at the role of testosterone in aggression and fear. When we look at the two hemispheres of the brain, right hemisphere processes negative emotion, while the left hemisphere tends to process positive emotion. If you need a quick mnemonic device, just assume that people who are happy like to talk. We imitate facial expressions. This is the chameleon effect, or something that we're going to later call isopraxis, that we tend to mirror people, especially when it comes to emotions, so we can then feel like we're in tune with their emotions. If someone's sad, you don't walk over smiling. Usually you kind of dampen your features. We utilize the mirror neurons that are in the prefrontal cortex of our brain when we do this. If you're not 100% certain that you understand what I'm saying, go back and read your textbook. Make sure you understand the feel good, do good. And this is going to be that entire idea that if you wake up in a good mood, you're more likely to do nice things for others. And then we start that entire pay it forward cycle. I go to, Starbucks and I decide I'm in a good mood. I'm going to buy the person behind me their coffee, and I go through the drive-through. They find out when they get up there, someone bought their order for them, makes them feel good. They want to do good. Last one is adaptation level phenomenon. So anytime we start relationships with people, and even when we're in relationships with people, we have a baseline for our emotional states. to make the person understand that you're happier or less happy with them, we have to show some change off of that baseline. So I use the example in the video that if every week you buy that person maybe a cup of coffee or you bring home flowers, eventually that becomes baseline. The week that you forget, you fall below baseline and they're going to worry if you're upset. But when you go back to buying them flowers every week, it's not novel, it's not new, it's just that's how it's become baseline. So if you want to do something truly romantic, bringing them home flowers doesn't change anything. You're going to have to go above and beyond. You're going to have to go a little bit bigger. So we adapt to a certain level of emotion and we then become sensitive to kind of fluctuations in that level. All right, that's it, guys. Quick review, like I said, make sure you read your textbook, make sure you go over all the PowerPoints. This, again, is not an exhaustive review, it's just a quick review.